Jordan Youngmann actually hails from upstate New York. He completed his master's degree from Mississippi State University in 2018. His thesis research explored the population genetics of white-tailed deer in the Southeast. He is currently working on his dissertation research under Dr. Gino D'Angelo at the University of Georgia. He's studying coyote populations in South Carolina. The project is a collaborative effort, including the UGA Deer Lab, U.S. Forest Service, South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory. The study is designed to estimate coyote densities across the state through spatial recapture, investigate resource selection, and assess population genetic structure. In his spare time, Jordan enjoys cooking wild game, exploring the outdoors through hunting, fishing, hiking, and spending time with his wife, son, and a menagerie of pets. Jordan, take it away.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Welcome all. So, I have titled my presentation for today, Coyotes in the Southeastern United States. How did they get here and what are they up to? The first half of my talk will be a broad brushstroke answer to those two questions. And then I'll spend the second half talking over my dissertation research and kind of what we hope to be able to do with it. Like Daniel mentioned, my name is Jordan Youngmann. I'm a PhD student at the University of Georgia, and I've been working on coyotes in South Carolina for the last 2 years. Previously, I was working on deer genetics at Mississippi State University for my thesis. We were looking at kind of population genetics of restored deer populations. But then I jumped on over to coyotes, which is super exciting. I grew up loving the species where I hailed from in the Northeast and was always interested in researching them when I grew up. And I guess I'm grown up now. So here we go. So I'm going to start very general, and forgive me if this is all too basic, but what is a coyote? The scientific name is Canis latrans. They are a medium-sized canid, and they range from 15 to about 45 pounds. And we're going to get into why that's a broad range. They are masters at adaptation. Even just their size range across their geographic range is highly variable. They measure from tip to tip, from tail tip to nose tip, about 5 feet. A third or so of that is their tail. They stand maybe 2+ feet at the shoulder off the ground. They're the size of a border collie, if you can picture that. Their coloring is kind of diverse as well, but generally this guy right here is pretty indicative of what you might see out in Georgia. Kind of tricolored black, grays, and browns. You'll notice how red this one individual is. And then I've included this melanistic coyote from the Savannah River site down here on the bottom. Melanism is not a common trait across the coyotes range, but it's more present for one reason or the other in the Southeast here where we live. Less than 10%, but significantly more black coyotes are found in the Southeast than elsewhere on its range. In terms of that broad range in size, you can break coyotes down into 3 major groups. The Western group, kind of west of the Mississippi, the Northeastern group as you move into New York and kind of the Eastern Midwest, Maine, Massachusetts, and then the Southeast. So all of the states kind of along the Gulf Coast, pushing up into Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia. And those represent both genetic groups. When we look at the population genetics across the range, those are the 3 major groups. And those genetic groups also match with morphological differences that you can kind of tell those 3 groups apart. And one of the morphological differences is this weight thing that I talked about before. You can see that Northeastern coyotes are significantly bigger than their Western and Southeastern neighbors. Southeastern coyotes tend to be larger than Western coyotes, but the differences are a little less stark. So when we talk about coyote range, their geographic range, it's a tricky thing. So I've been really delving into this for 2 years, and I still have to go back and check notes to kind of make sense of what the Coyote range is. And the reason for that is the overarching theme is of expansion and retraction. So they appeared in the fossil record upwards of 1 million years ago. And over that time, their range has expanded and contracted in relation to other competing predators on the landscape, like wolves. They were compatriots of the dire wolf back in the Pleistocene, red wolves, gray wolves, and then also different land cover types that we've seen over that entire range of years. And so trying to pin down what a coyote home range or species range is kind of a tough thing. But suffice it to say, they appeared in the fossil record about 1 million years ago, and they were actually present in the eastern U.S. alongside dire wolves up until about 11,000 years ago. And then because of a variety of different circumstances, that range contracted to what we kind of recognize as their present day endemic range, which is kind of Western United States. And so if you look at this map here, you can kind of see in the red what the probable pre-Columbian range of coyotes were prior to the 16th century, or the kind of European wave of colonization on North America. And again, it's these Western states pushing down into Mexico. There is a range expansion that follows kind of the Spanish coming into the country or the continent here in blue, expanding down south into Central America. And then a second range expansion pushing up into Alaska and Canada during the mid 1800s. But then in terms of where we sit geographically, beginning in the mid 1900s, we see coyotes starting to push into eastern United States. So again, they were here 11,000 years ago. And so when we talk about coyotes being a non-native to the east, we're kind of correct on a short time scale, but incorrect in terms of kind of geologic time. And so in the 1900s, coyotes start to push east. They move from the Midwest or west of the Mississippi, north of the Great Lakes, down into the Northeast. They push through the Midwest into the Northeast, hundreds into Southeastern United States. And so the coyotes that we know today in Georgia come from kind of the Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas area and have pushed over the last half plus century into the Southeast. And with that push has come a little bit of hybridization with other canid species. And this is something that's commonly talked about when we talk about coyotes. I'm not sure if a coy wolf or a coy dog is something that is part of your vernacular. When I was growing up in the Northeast, everybody talked about coy dogs. They were big coyotes that must have interbred with dogs. Well, come to find out, those coyotes that I grew up with in the Northeast are coy dogs. If you had to accurately describe any kind of hybridization of coy wolf, because what happened was there was some amount of interbreeding between dispersing coyotes out of the upper Midwest here over the Great Lakes, and some hybridization did occur here in Canada with Great Lakes wolves. And then that introgression of wolf genetics has migrated down into the Northeast. Not great amounts of hybridization occurred, but enough that we can detect it, and enough that some of the size differences we see in the Northeast is at least partially due to wolf genetics within the coyote genome. In terms of the Southeast, wolves were eradicated in the 1900s, and specifically they would have been red wolves here in the Southeast. And so when coyotes expanded into the Southeast, there was actually no other canid species competing in the Southeast. They were coming in as the only wild canid, but there are remnant populations in North Carolina of red wolves. And in those localized spots, there has been interbreeding and hybridization between coyotes and red wolves, but not to the same extent in terms of influencing an entire, group of coyotes like the expansion into the Northeast. And then in terms of hybridization with dogs, we find dog genetics within sampled coyotes, but it's a very low percentage, and the hybridization between coyotes and dogs is not a influencing factor in the coyotes we find in the Southeast or anywhere. And in fact, the little amount of admixture we see with dogs only kind of occurs east of the Mississippi. You can imagine dispersing coyotes coming into new areas without any other coyotes around. You might have had a couple cases of interbreeding between dogs and coyotes, but coyote populations exploded at such a rapid rate that wasn't a constant state of hybridization. So all that is to say that eastern coyotes tend to be bigger than their western. That is partially due to hybridization with wolves, and then also due to rapid adaptation due to dispersal, that as you're dispersing into new areas, being larger and stronger is a beneficial thing. And coyotes move so rapidly across the eastern United States that adaptive pressure was strong enough to cause differences in morphometrics that we see today. And I didn't really touch on, but the reason for this dispersal, for this colonization of the eastern U.S. was because in the 1900s, we eradicated all the wolves in the eastern United States, all the cougars, and we did a fair amount of landscape modification. We changed the landscape drastically. And so suddenly coyotes out west had this new landscape, this new front that was fairly open, which is what they're used to, and also was devoid of any competitor and so they moved eastward. So that's how they got here. And now what are they doing here? Well, real generally, what their life history is, they kind of go through a yearly cycle. They are monogamous, as all canid species are. Males and females will go through about 2-month courtship period in the late fall and early winter. Mated pairs will breed in the winter, and it's a 63-day approximately gestation period. So pups in the Southeast are getting here sometime in mid-March through mid-May. They are denned up for that time for several weeks. And then as pups get more precocious, about a month or two after birth, they are moved from the den site to a rendezvous site, to a site where a pack spends time within their home range. Throughout the summer, they will get more and more precocious, increase their activity, and will be potentially ready for dispersal by the fall. And now fall is a tricky time for coyotes because a majority of mortality occurs during the fall through incidental harvest due to hunting season. So we'll talk about kind of population management here in the Southeast in a little bit, but by and large, human mortality happens either through roadkill or through folks out deer hunting and seeing a coyote and shooting it. And so we'll get into kind of pack structure here in a second, but mortality is a main cause of dispersal. And so young juvenile individuals start dispersing if they're going to disperse sometime in the fall. Which brings us to one of the big takeaways for my talk. Coyotes exhibit kind of a dual life strategy of being either a resident or a transient. Now, residents are typically breeding pairs, juveniles, and their pups. And so when we talk about a pack of coyotes, what we're actually talking about are resident coyotes forming 4 to 6 in the Southeast, 4 to 6 individuals. If you have low mortality and plenty of resources, the number of individuals within a pack can go up. Out west, sometimes you're seeing 12, 14 plus individuals make up a pack. Here in the East, because they tend to have a lot more fragmentation within kind of their pack structure, We don't see that many individuals, but these residents are holding and defending territories. They have a fairly consistent, constant home range that has enough resources within it to support the number of individuals they have. Part of the reason individuals disperse is if you're having pups each year, eventually your carrying capacity within your home range is met. And so adults will kick out juveniles, and those juveniles then will disperse. And when they disperse, they enter that second life strategy of a coyote, which is to be a transient. And transients are typically single individuals. They are nomadic and will do absolutely incredible walkabouts of hundreds of miles, searching for territory to set up and become a resident. That's kind of the end goal, is to find somewhere that has what you need to live and become a resident, find a mate, and form a pack. Now, an interesting thing that coyotes do while transient is it's dangerous to be out on the road. You don't know your environment, and you don't know how to get food, and you don't know what dangers are out there. And so what transients will do sometimes is, as they move through the landscape looking for a home range, they will set up these biding areas where they form what looks like a home range for a period of time until the resident coyotes from that area kick them out, or something happens that causes them to disperse further. But generally, transients are out looking for a mate and a home range to establish a pack. And this combination of resident packs holding down territories and transients moving across the landscape is what establishes and maintains metapopulations in coyotes. Now, metapopulations are just essentially that, where you have populations of breeding individuals that are connected genetically by dispersing, immigrating, and emigrating individuals. So you have populations across the landscape that are genetically linked by dispersing individuals. And coyotes are a prime example of metapopulation dynamics. And it's the reason that they're so successful, that you have kind of these home bases where survivorship is fairly high. And then you have individuals or life stages where you're seeking out across the landscape. And so by doing that, you have populations and an entire species move across, say, the eastern United States very quickly and successfully. In terms of their space use, they come generally from the west. They prefer more open landscapes for living in, for hunting in. We know that resident coyotes are associated with agricultural areas whenever possible. And again, if you can think of, resident is defending a territory, well, they're going to defend territories that are most advantageous. And so part of the choice of agricultural areas is they tend to be able to get the resources they need in those kind of locations. Transients will use roads for dispersal, which infers risk. They're much more likely to be hit by cars. For that reason, resident coyotes tend to avoid roads, but transients use them to facilitate dispersal, to get going where they need to get going as fast as possible. Home ranges of resident coyotes have a great variety of sizes, but somewhere, and this is a huge range, but 1 to 30 square miles. Recently, Ward et al. In 2018 did a pretty massive study looking at about 150 collared coyotes across Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. They found on average about 80% of the coyotes lived within 8 square miles or so. So these residents are defending territories that are relatively small compared to kind of the geographic coverage of these metapopulations of transients and residents. And what you can see here, this is a graphic taken from Ward et al. In 2018. You can see these home ranges in different circles. Now, what you're looking at here is, like in yellow, you have a home range, and then you have your 95% kernel density core area. So the home range these coyotes are defending, these resident coyotes are defending, is that diameter, but then they spend a majority of time within this circle. And so you got these donut looking home ranges. And what you'll notice is these residents are defending territories that have a combination of different landscape types. So a combination of open and forested, wetland, lots of edge habitat. And these are all things indicative of the kind of space use that coyotes prefer. The other thing you'll notice is these defended territories are fairly well delineated. You don't have a whole lot of overlap between resident coyote home ranges. And what I've heard it described as is kind of like a puzzle piece across the landscape, as these coyotes have colonized the east and set up populations. Those home ranges are oftentimes, if the resources are there, smack up against each other. And so as transients move across the landscape looking for a place to live, they sometimes don't have anywhere to go because you have resident packs defending up into each other's borders. And so that's why transients sometimes will go hundreds of miles to try to find a place to set up a home range. So one of the big things that everybody talks about is what coyotes eat. They're a predator. I think we as humans are psychologically predisposed to be pretty worried about what predators eat. I think that's buried deep within our rat brain. And so a lot of ink has been spilled on what they eat. A lot of research has been done on it. They are omnivorous. They will eat any number of things available to them. They are opportunistic. I think opportunistic, if you had to look a coyote up in a dictionary, would be one of the first words used. They exhibit something we call prey switching. And so that's just where you change the prey type that you focus on based off of the resources that are available, the kind of landscape you have available. Essentially, you're trying to maximize your energy intake against kind of the amount of energy you got to put in to get food. And so what coyotes are really good at is focusing in on prey types that allow them to maximize their diet intake. And so being omnivorous helps with that. And also these dual life stages of resident and transients help with that, because residents eat a slightly different makeup of food items than transients do. This graph right here is again from Ward et al. In 2018. It shows through the year. So you've got big prey species types broken down. You got white-tailed deer, you got rabbit, which makes up a huge portion of coyote diets in certain places of the country. Small mammals, so that's rodents such as cotton rats and mice and squirrels and the like. And then here, I mean, a big thing about coyotes and what they eat is during the right times of year, they will absolutely hammer whatever fruit is out there. We sample for my research in the summer. And so in the beginning portion of our season, we will find scat that is almost completely blackberries. It looks essentially like a pile of macerated blackberries on the ground. And that's all they're eating for a couple weeks out of the year. This time they are absolutely keying in on persimmons trees as they start dropping, as are every other animal and human in the woods. But they use fruit whenever available. And you can see across the year that they are to some degree shifting what they eat. You see these peaks of consuming white-tailed deer correlates with May, which is when deer are fawning. And we'll talk about that in a second. That peak in that time of year kind of coincides with a dip in rabbits and a dip in small mammals. You see that they're not eating much fruit up until the summer, and then they get as much of it as they can through the fruiting seasons of various plant species. And so again, this prey switching idea, what they're doing is they're just maximizing their diet potential throughout the year by switching between prey types in a way that's most advantageous to them. So the big prey item that we talk about here in the Southeast for coyotes is deer. We know that they can heavily prey on white-tailed deer fawns. Studies across the Southeast has shown that, something like a third of fawns are taken by coyotes in certain parts of the world, especially early on in fawning when fawns are essentially defenseless other than their cryptic ability to camouflage and hide themselves. There is evidence of coyotes preying on adult deer, and the amount of evidence is small, but there's some debate over how much that occurs across the Southeast. Again, we've only seen it a couple times, or it's only been documented in the literature a couple times. All the studies that we do on deer where we have collars on adult deer all over the country, very few cases of those deer being preyed on by coyotes. But we have interesting diet analysis of coyotes showing that throughout the year, coyotes are eating deer. And we can tell through hair pulled from a scat the difference between an adult deer and a fawn. And so we know that except for during the fawn season, these coyotes, if they're eating deer, which they are eating at least juvenile up white-tailed deer. So there's got to be some explanation for that intake of deer in their diet. And so the debate kind of goes back and forth between, is that coyotes directly preying on deer, or is that scavenging from roadkill, from hunter carcass, hunter wounded animals? What's comprising the venison being eaten by a coyote in these times of the year that aren't fawning? And so there's some research out there that kind of logically works through, well, when are they eating? When are they eating it? And some people suggest that there probably is more direct take of at least juvenile deer throughout the year that helps account for the amount of deer eaten throughout the year. But anyways, I've talked a lot about that. That tends to be one of the big topics of conversation when it comes to coyotes is, well, what do they eat? We know that they eat deer, and we know for a fact that they really do get after deer fawns during the spring. We know that they are eating some amount of deer the rest of the year, and we're still a little uncertain how much of that deer the rest of the year is through direct predation and how much of it is scavenging or something like that. Interestingly, there's not a whole lot of evidence for predation on avian species. So we know that they eat a lot of small mammals, fruit, insects, deer, but there's not a whole lot from the scat analysis done so far showing that they're eating avian species. And that includes ground nesting birds. So you would think that an opportunistic omnivore generalist predator like a coyote would take the opportunity of eating either hens or nesting birds or eggs during the nesting season. And we haven't found a whole lot of evidence thus far of that. We do know that they can be advantageous for some of those species, including things like sea turtles along the coast, because what they do is they either compete with or directly kill other mesopredators that are known predators of eggs and ground nesting birds. And so there's been some research out there showing that as coyotes have moved into the Southeast, we've actually seen upticks in some of these avian species because they help dampen the amount of effects that things like raccoons and possums and the like have on those species. I'll just point out that looking for a nice picture of a coyote going after, apparently enough people have been asking how coyotes eat raccoons that they had to make a web page for it, which I found interesting. Don't know who's out there with that question in their head, but. So we got this quote unquote novel predator on the landscape, at least in modern history. They've moved into the Southeast. We know out west for a couple hundred years now, we've been trying to manage coyote populations through lethal control. In certain parts of our history, pretty dramatically spent time and resources doing so. And the effect of that longstanding policy of control out west was coyote populations are doing fine out there, and they in fact have doubled their home range. And so in terms of what this species does in the face of adversity, it's pretty remarkable what they can withstand and then how they react and compensate for that kind of pressure. Here in the Southeast, most of coyote control or management happens through private means. So it's private landowners who want to control coyote population. They're going to be trapping them. Like I mentioned, a lot of mortality just comes from incidental take during deer season. There is some evidence that coyote removal increases fawn recruitment. There have been a couple studies that have removed coyotes and seen an increase in the number of fawns that are surviving in the springtime. But there's just as many studies out there showing that coyote removal is either not successful or is kind of a mixed bag in terms of your results. Kilgo et al. Spent a number of years for a study. They had trappers come in and absolutely remove all the coyotes they could get their hands on. So they removed 78% of the coyotes on the landscape in their study site over 3 years. They had 23% fawn survival pre-removal, which is low. And so they removed the first year coyotes, that doubles to about 50%, 51% fawn survival. They remove coyotes again, it drops the next year down to 20%. They remove coyotes the third year, it goes up to 43%. So you have this fluctuation of fawn survival, even with coyote removal. They removed 78% of coyotes for 3 years, and within 9 months of ending the trapping program, the numbers had rebounded to pre-trapping numbers. So in terms of the success of coyote removal to meet objectives such as increasing fawn recruitment, it's a mixed bag as to how successful you can be. People found your best chance of success is just localized, intense trapping prior to fawning season. The reason for this and the reason for the mixed bag of success and for the overall success of coyote populations across the United States is that this ability to both hold down home ranges, but then have transients who are out looking for home ranges means that you always have individuals that are ready to backfill a vacuum. They'll always fill a void. Again, they will fill 78% of the hole you've made in about half a year or 9 months. They also have been documented to show compensatory reproduction, which is where as coyotes are removed, they will have more pups as they go. This brings us to my work. So I came in 2 years ago because the state of South Carolina was looking to answer a couple questions. And some of this is review now, but essentially we had coyotes come into the east. We've seen concurrent declines in deer herds in the southeast. Now, there's a little bit of back and forth about how much the coyotes can be blamed for the decline, but suffice it to say, we've had coyotes come in, deer numbers are on a decline. But like we just talked about, unless you're doing really localized control, the chances of you managing coyote populations is essentially nil. And state agency knows that they can't, on a state level, control coyote populations. It's been suggested that if there are places where coyotes are depressing deer numbers, you can give deer populations the leg up by things like reassessing antlerless harvest. People can't take as many does off the landscape, things like that. So there are practical management answers to some of these things, but you kind of have to know how many coyotes you have out and about within your state. So South Carolina funded a project that I'm a part of, trying to get a good handle on how many coyotes are across the state of South Carolina. So our big objectives were, we're going to use spatial capture, recapture to estimate coyote densities across the ecoregion. We were going to see where they like to be, resource selection, just associating variations in coyote abundance with adjacent landscape characteristics. And then because of my background in population genetics and because we still don't have a clear idea how these metapopulations work, I just wanted to look at the general population structure of coyotes across the state of South Carolina. So we collected Scat last year and this year during the summer. We have sample sites across the entire state, but we broke the state down into its three major ecoregions: the Piedmont, the Southeastern plains here in the middle, and the Middle Atlantic coastal plain. These ecoregions represent kind of big landscape level differences in land cover types. We've got 10 total sample sites now, 4 up in the Piedmont and then 3 each in the other 2 ecoregions. And at these sites, there are massive, we're on Savannah River site, and that's 350 square miles or something of land. And so we cover that site in transects along gravel roads that we can drive, because what we're doing is we're picking up coyote scat and then doing genetic work to figure out what individual left that scat. We do that through microsatellite DNA. And so when we have all of our scat, we know where we found it and we know what individual left it. We're able to do spatial capture recapture, which is just kind of the next generation of your basic mark recapture study. We're just incorporating the spatial arrangement of our samples on the landscape. That allows us to estimate density. We can then relate that density to landscape level differences, habitat preferences to get resource selection. And then each of my 10 sample sites, I'll treat as a population and compare and contrast those populations across the state to see how much genetic flow is happening between each population. If you treat each of those populations as a metapopulation and then assume that there's gene flow between, you can get a sense of how that metapopulation is spread across the state. The reason we want to do it statewide is that most studies done on coyotes are at a much smaller scale. And because of their transiency, because of the great distances that they move, studying their populations kind of has to happen at bigger geographic scales. We will continue to try to get at what kind of landscape they prefer, looking at these big ecoregions. If there's a difference between densities between those ecoregions, we can make inferences as to why. Again, looking at population connectivity and then inform state agencies on how to manage their deer populations in the face of a novel predator. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about, we added a component about a year ago to my dissertation. We want to look at what they're eating. And specifically, we want to try to further get at whether or not they're eating bird species such as wild turkeys or quail, ground nesting birds. Like I mentioned before, traditional scat analysis hasn't really found any evidence of consumption of birds. The way that analysis is done is whole scat is taken, all of the interstitial material is washed away, so you're left with just the diet items, the seeds, the bones, the hair, and you pick through that and you identify what they've been eating. There's some concern that that doesn't get at some of these avian species. And so recently, the technology of DNA metabar coding has allowed people to look at diet through the genetics found within the scat. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take 3 of our sample sites, of our 10 sample sites. We sampled this spring from mid-May to mid-June, which coincides with both peak nesting for turkeys and peak fawning for deer. We're sampling at these 3 sites. Same kind of idea. We drive transects, drive roads, and pick up scat. This is a close-up of one of my sample sites, and you can see how this is probably about 150 square miles, how we have 50 plus miles worth of roads strung out along our site. Every third day we go and collect scat, so we make sure that it's fresh, which aids in our genetic analysis. But what we do is we collect scat, we extract the DNA, all the DNA found in the scat, we extract it, we amplify, so we make more of that DNA at specific regions of the DNA that are then able to match to a database. And those are what we call the barcodes. And so that then just allows us to identify the species of prey or diet within the scat. And those databases are huge. The theoretical potential, like what we can do with this kind of technology, is pretty astounding. We can look at kind of gut bacteria, parasite loads, all those kind of things using this. And we get to look once more with a little bit more clarity at diet preferences of a novel species, a novel predator on the landscape. So where are we at? Yeah, let me wrap it up. They are in some ways non-native to the East in terms of our collective historical memory, but they are in fact endemic to North America, the continent. Their range has expanded and contracted over thousands and thousands of years. The most recent expansion into the Southeast occurred in the late 1900s. Populations exhibit kind of metapopulation dynamics and are maintained through this kind of dual life strategy of resident and transient individuals. They are omnivorous, but it's been shown that they can prey pretty heavily on white-tailed deer and other game species. It's almost impossible to manage them at a large scale. They've shown for a couple centuries now that they are resilient, pretty resilient to lethal control, at least. In fact, have expanded their range. Some of the stuff we want to do as researchers is we want to see, well, how many of them are across the landscape? Where do they like to be? What do they like to eat? So that we can have a better idea of how they fit into our ecosystem as it looks today. I'd like to thank my collaborative departments across Georgia and South Carolina. That's a picture of me picking up coyote poop for a living, which is what I do. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Jordan, thank you very much for being here in that wonderful presentation. And I hope in the near future, when I can call you Dr. Youngmann, that you will come back and let us know the results of your research.
I shall.
Rich, if you want to comment in, if you're here, we got a bunch of questions in the Q&A box, and I guess we can go down those. And I'm not sure if that's done by him hitting answer live to answer them or not. For the viewers on Facebook Live, there might be a couple of questions that aren't asked here that I might actually chime in on and throw out there as well that just general people might be interested in answering as well. With that said, Rich, I just want to ask real quick, if you're here, how are they going to answer via answer live? How's Jordan going to answer via answer live?
I can just read them right here. And
okay.
I think, I don't know how much time we got, but I think I can rip through. There's 10 of them. I can get through them, I think.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Jordan, just peel through those and pick the ones that you want to answer most. If we need to get folks out of here by any particular
How much time do we have, Daniel?
As much time as you want.
Well, here we go. We got more coming in. So yeah, we'll get as many as we can. Just call it when you want. I'm here. We can always answer them later. So we got questions. Coyotes prefer open areas and deer prefer forested areas. Do deer make up only a small portion of coyotes' diets? So those are kind of big generalizations in terms of preference. We find coyotes all across the landscape in forested and open habitats. If you'll remember from the home range, they prefer generally different, like open landscapes, but they like to have a variety within their home range because it allows them to access different prey types for that prey switching kind of behavior. Deer prefer forested areas, but prefer kind of early successional open forested areas, which coyotes also key in on. There's research done up in the Adirondacks in New York showing that coyotes are there in the old growth forest, but they're keying in on kind of those early successional openings. And so, there's slightly different kind of habitat preferences between deer and coyote, but there's, I think, probably more overlap than you might suppose. This past Sunday, a group of 4 adult deer came running through our yard, followed distantly by one coyote in full run. Our yard is on the Yell River. Did that coyote actually hope to catch an adult deer? I think it hoped to. I don't know if it did. I think the records we have of adult take of deer by coyotes, oftentimes those are packs working together. I know out west where coyote packs get bigger, they are more frequently documented taking large game down. And so the coyote on his own, though he hoped to catch the deer, I don't know if he would have been able to, but a pack certainly can if they can get a hold of one. And again, this is getting at kind of the edge of what we know about southeastern coyotes is how often do they actually do that? Are there any regulations limiting shooting of coyotes in Georgia? I should know these rules better, being a hunter myself, but I don't really focus on coyotes. But I think on public land, it has to be within a hunting season, but on private land, I think it's open season year round. But do not quote me on that. So they are trying to increase deer populations here. Where I come from, they are trying to reduce deer populations. Yeah, so this is always something that gets said, and essentially the takeaway is we've got a lot of deer in the Southeast. Having coyotes knocking numbers back doesn't necessarily look like a bad thing. And it's like this question states, I think, a more localized question of across the Southeast, we have a lot of deer. In certain places, we are generally across the region seeing a decline in deer, and there are parts of states where there are less deer. As a state agency looking to manage deer populations, you're answering to a bunch of different stakeholders. And so they're trying to, as best they can, manage a deer population for the good of many different opposing viewpoints, I guess. Is prey size a factor in size difference between Northeast coyotes and Southeast coyotes, in addition to the hybridization with wolves you mentioned? That's a tricky question. What I would guess is that the size of coyotes informs the prey that they're eating more than vice versa, but they're kind of inextricably linked, that hybridization and adaptation from fast dispersal made a bigger coyote, and therefore they're doing well here partially by taking larger prey such as deer. Size is definitely linked to what prey they eat. We know that larger coyotes eat more deer. There's been research showing that on that hybridization zone between red wolves and coyotes in the Carolinas, hybridized coyotes are bigger and eat more deer. I live in a wooded neighborhood with lots of wildlife, including coyotes. Occasionally, individuals will be seen roaming the neighborhood during the day. Any information on coyotes attacking humans? I have heard stories like news reports that does happen, but very, very infrequently. I would be concerned about it, but I would not also want my 2-year-old son, running around if I know a coyote is out there, But point being, it's not like a human concern. I don't think it's high on the list, but there has been cases of that. Do you have any idea what % of their diet is domestic garbage pet food? I don't have specific numbers on that. There's been a couple diet studies done in urban settings, and they definitely are using garbage. They're definitely, as opportunistic as they are, they get at any of those available, those food options. We know that if there are feral cats out or domestic, pet cats out, they'll eat cats and small dogs. Kind of similar to the question about attacks on humans. They're opportunistic, and so to some degree, they'll try to get anything they can get their teeth into. The one other thing I'll say about humans is they are very much wary of human presence. We have a lot of urban coyotes around, but they tend to be fairly skittish still. How many, if any, are tagged in South Carolina? Are there any trail camera videos set up in the Scat collecting area? We're still processing our Scat data in the lab. The range of Scat we collected from any given site is, again, highly variable. I think at least in part due to variation in density of coyotes in those areas. We find on average 50 Scat over a 2-week sampling period at our sites. We don't have any trail cameras set up. That's something that if I had all the time and resources would not be a bad idea, but we don't have it at our site. How many are on your research team in the field? I play puppet master with 4 techs that are across the entire state, sampling at sites, and they sample 2 sites at a 2-week interval. So they go back and forth between the sites for 2 weeks and then move to 2 other sites. And I kind of hop around, making sure everything is working. Great presentation. Thank you very much. From what I learned today, I think our resident pack is getting ready to kick the pups out. Also, if you need Scat, please go to my Scat routinely on the driveway. I've noticed fewer squirrels, raccoons, and deer. It's very good information. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure giving this talk. And yeah, it just depends on how many individuals are in the pack, whether they're going to kick out all of their pups. But yeah, they're at this point pretty precocious and able to take care of themselves. And yeah, when I tell people about my struggles finding Scat at some of my sites, the answer always is, well, I see it all the time. Can you please explain what spatial capture recapture is? So capture recapture is where you have a sample period where you capture as many individuals as you can, and then you release them. And then at another interval, you go out and capture again. And some subset of the second capture will be those individuals that you had already tagged from before. And you can do that at regular intervals for a period of time. And so then the ratio of recaptures to overall captures essentially gives you an estimate of abundance. And what spatial capture recapture is doing just that, but you're incorporating where you're capturing them around an entire sample site so that you can not only get abundance, but you can more accurately do that and also get at density, which would be abundance over a geographic range. And the way we do it is we don't go out and catch coyotes. We pick up their Scat and then use genetics to say, okay, that's Coyote 1, that's Coyote 2, that's Coyote 3, that's Coyote 1 again. And we're able to do just that. Is it true that if a coyote is seen during the day roaming through a neighborhood, that means it is sick? Not necessarily. If it's behaving straight, like it being out during the day is probably slightly abnormal, but not concerning. It being out during the day and behaving oddly, i.e. some of the indicators of rabies or something like that, could mean that it's sick. Either way, general rule, avoid interacting with coyotes across the board, observe them from a distance. And yeah, if they're out during the day and slobbery and listless and behaving strangely, definitely call your local animal control or law enforcement. Their habit in my area is being clear for housing. Also, part of where I think the den is located is a large pond house, Canada geese. Would they be eating the geese? I'm not sure. No geese nesting area. I think if the opportunity arose, they would. I wouldn't want to be something of coyote size or my size messing with a goose on the nest. What I know of Canada geese, they will beat the hell out of you. But yeah, I think if they could make it happen, they would. Again, most of the studies we found have found very little avian prey within coyote diets, but that doesn't discount that if they could make good on the opportunity, they would. Is anyone studying the population inside I-285, the Beltway surrounding Atlanta? I know they're considered a pest in Midtown and Decatur counties inside. Off the top of my head, I can't pin any studies going on right now. The big ones I know of, I mean, a lot of big cities have coyote populations being studied, but a lot of work has come out of Chicago looking at urban. I mean, that's like as urban as it gets. And I would imagine in some places in Atlanta, it's similar, but they are thriving populations of coyotes within the cities. Well, coyotes come inside fenced yard after small dog in a wooded area. What is the best way to deter them, homes, and pets? So anecdotally, I haven't heard of coyotes coming within fenced yards. I'm sure they would if they felt comfortable doing it. In terms of deterrent, again, they don't like human presence. And so, especially as an adult, if your dog's on the leash, then I think you're totally fine. I have no concerns for my two dogs being out. My one dog is pushing 100 pounds and the size of a wolf, literally. So I'm not worried about her. And my other dog is a little collie mix. And maybe if she was on her own running through the woods, I would cross my mind. But I don't spend a lot of time worried about coyotes. They are definitely not interested in messing with humans. Because again, most of the mortality that they experience comes at our hands. And they didn't get to where they're at now by ignoring that threat. You know anything about rabies in coyotes? Not much, just that, I mean, it's possible and something to look out. I don't know prevalence rates or anything like that. Mange is a big thing that they face from time to time. You'll see populations that have mange. And so, those coyotes will definitely not look well. But do fox and coyotes share territory? That's a great one to end on. There's overlap, but fox avoid coyotes. And there's been some studies done down in South Georgia looking at gray fox and coyotes, and gray fox will actually get pretty close and comfortable to human development in an abnormal way. So generally they wouldn't want to be near humans, but when coyotes are on the landscape, they will kind of move their home ranges tight to human development because coyotes don't want to be near humans. And so they are avoiding coyotes as best they can by actually using us as a shield, which is pretty neat to see. But yeah, again, I mean, that's a predator that does have impacts on ground nesting birds, and coyotes on the landscape are alleviating some of that pressure. Well, there we go. Fast and Furious, we did it. Any other questions?
Jordan, I won't lie. I have a question. Yeah. You mentioned coyote packs earlier in the presentation. What is the typical pack structure for coyotes in comparison to wolves? How does it differ?
Yeah, so I'll speak broadly because distinctions, I won't get in the weeds, but it's a similar idea. It's a family structure, right? That you've got breeding pairs and offspring and then pups. But coyote pack, I think, is a little bit more liquid in that transiency is a significant portion of the population. Something like 30% of the population is transient. And so the pack dynamic is a little bit more fluid because individuals are getting kicked out and going on walkabout in a way that you don't see quite as much with wolves.
Okay. And we do have a question from Facebook Live viewers. How far south do coyote populations extend?
That's a good question. I think we're just actually, Daniel and I were talking about this on the phone the other day. So let me see. Let me get back to. So this map from Hody and Kays in 2018 show them down to the very bottom of Central America. And I believe even since then, we've had individuals caught on trail camera that have pushed down into South America now. So they are continuing as we speak to be expanding their range.
Well, it sounds like they'll be all across the Americas pretty soon. Well, with that, Jordan, I want to thank you so much for being here with us. And I hope that when we have another Master Naturalist class, you'll be a part of that with us as well. I guess we'll go ahead and close out the presentation.
Thank you guys so much. It was an absolute ball.